Hi there, everyone. So, this is a particularly relevant topic for me, and I know it is for many people. Most of us, at some point in our lives, or perhaps, multiple times in our lives, have encountered nosy or intrusive people. And to me, nosy people kind of go along in the same vein as people who have a problem with boundaries and kind of tend to invade your personal space. I find that the two tend to go together. And this is something I've struggled with. I've struggled with dealing with these sorts of people throughout my life. But lately, I feel as if I have a much better handle on it. And I wanted to share some of my thoughts and experiences and opinions about how you can effectively deal with nosy people. Because let's face it, they can be very stressful to deal with. It can be incredibly difficult to know how to navigate these situations without it blowing up into a conflict or some sort of drama, which many of us just don't want. And at the same time, their behavior can make us intensely uncomfortable. And we want to honor ourselves, or we really should honor ourselves. So, navigating these kinds of people can be a little bit complex, I guess. And I wanted to share some advice that I have that might help you to feel better about these situations and help you to resolve the situation in such a way that feels good for you. I just want to point out before I continue, I'm really not an expert or any sort of mental health professional. I'm purely someone who has dealt with these situations a lot in my own life, and I feel that I've got to a point where I can kind of navigate them a lot more confidently. And so I just want to share what I've learned and what I've seen and the kind of insight that I've gained with all of you in the hopes that perhaps it'll help. I want to go into quite a lot of detail in this video, so it's not just going to be a quick, 3 easy steps and then we're done. I do want to go into quite a lot of detail because I think it's important. Thinking about these sorts of topics deeply helps me. And this video is designed for someone who also wants to think about this topic in a very kind of detailed and deep way. So the first part of the video, I'm going to divide the video into 3 parts. It's just going to be sort of a chatty kind of video, but I'm going to divide it into 3 parts. The first part is looking at nosy and intrusive people and who they are. The second part of the video will be how nosy people tend to affect you, the person who is kind of the target of their nosiness. And then the third part is some strategies that you can use to deal with nosy people and put them off the scent and get them to kind of leave you alone. So let's go into the first part. Who are nosy people? Nosy people really come in all shapes and sizes, and they can come at you from pretty much any direction. There might be people who are close to you, immediate family, close friends even can be nosy and can overstep your boundaries. There might be sort of more distant family, perhaps aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents that you might only see a few times a year. There might be co-workers, that's a big one for a lot of people, or neighbors, or they could be complete strangers. So nosy people really can, come from any sort of area of our life. I think you can divide them into 2 categories. You get the sort of benign nosy people who are basically kind-hearted, don't wish you any harm, fairly well intentioned. They're just, unself-aware. They lack the social graces to know that they're being nosy. But they're not malicious. And then you get people in the category who are malicious, who are intending to get information out of you in order to do you some sort of harm, or someone else some sort of harm. But they basically, they might be, people who just have a thirst for drama, who don't really care about the well-being of others. So I think it's important to distinguish what category the nosy person you are dealing with falls into. Is this a benign nosy person, or is this a malicious nosy person? And you can usually tell which one they are if you look at their behavior as a whole. If you look at how other people respond to them or feel about them, gather clues to help you determine whether this nosy person is a good person or a harmful person. In my experience, I think the majority of the nosy people that I have dealt with fall into the benign category. They're not really intending to do you harm, and any harm that they do tends to be more kind of accidental or unintentional. It doesn't make them any more comfortable to deal with, really. Benign nosy people are still incredibly annoying, and they still need to be you still need to be clear and firm with them. But I think if you at least know that this person doesn't mean you any harm, that they're basically a good person and well-intentioned at heart, it can make you kind of relax a little bit more in the situation if you aren't, terrified of what they're going to do with any information they might extract from you. But there is a minority of people who are maliciously nosy, who are trying to extract information from others constantly in order to use it to their own advantage and create situations that might not be in other people's best interests. And, people who kind of have no problem creating drama and creating messes that other people then have to clean up. I've known people like that as well. So just try to decide for yourself which category your nosy person falls into. Benign nosy people are much easier to deal with, I will say. They tend to be the people who back off more easily than the malicious ones. Malicious ones ultimately don't really care about your comfort level, and so they might keep coming at you even after you put strong boundaries in place, and you might need to be firmer with those sorts of people. And you might even need to take more extreme steps to deal with a malicious, nosy person, which we'll discuss in the third part of this video. But let's talk about why nosy people are the way that they are. I have some theories. I'm not going to say that I know all the reasons why nosy people are the way that they are, and I'm not stating my opinion as a fact. But I have some theories about why nosy people are this way. I think for me, the first and most obvious reason for people being nosy is that they have a void in their own lives that they are trying to fill. I believe nosy people are basically unsatisfied, unfulfilled people in at least, a few major areas. They have never really become self-actualized in themselves. They've never kind of reached their own potential, perhaps because they don't know how, perhaps their development was stunted. We don't really know, but what we do know is that they have an unhealthy interest in other people's lives. And I believe that this comes from an emptiness inside themselves. So nosy people often have insecurities as well about people liking them, I believe. This is something I've noticed. They're aware on some level that their behavior in being nosy is not great. But they're either unable or unwilling to really examine their behavior and try to change it on any kind of deep level because it's too painful. They'd rather just continue to be the way that they are and deal with people's reactions on kind of a case-by-case basis, and all in an effort to escape this sense that they might not be very likable people. This is, again, as I say, this is just a theory. This is just something that I've noticed. So I think nosy people are often unfulfilled, often insecure about their own kind of likability, their own ability to connect with people authentically. See, when someone is prying into your life for details, that's not true and authentic connection. That is, it's false bonding because one person is taking an unhealthy interest in someone else whilst the other person is actually kind of pulling away from that person, trying either not to reveal too much or trying to think of ways that they can escape the situation. So it's not true and authentic bonding and connecting. It's not two people connecting on an authentic level. And so I believe that nosy people actually have a real problem with authentic connection and authentic relationships. They tend to try and characterize people according to certain stereotypes or try to put people into boxes. And they try to gather information to reinforce their views of those people. This is another thing I've noticed with nosy people. And they have a real problem seeing people for who they are. Instead, they see them in the kind of predetermined filter that they've created for themselves. You're probably going to have a very hard time creating an authentic friendship or relationship or connection with a nosy person because they lack the ability to see you for who you are. The entire reason why they're being nosy is in order to confirm certain kind of biases and beliefs that they have about people. Again, that's just my theory. But this is something that I've noticed. And so I would encourage you not to put too much pressure on yourself to try and salvage the relationship with a nosy person and try to turn it into some sort of authentic friendship and relationship, because I think that's pretty unlikely. Nosy people generally only know how to connect with others by either oversharing or prying into that person's personal business. And that's, as I've mentioned before, not really true, authentic connection. That's not true sharing. And I've noticed people tend to tolerate nosy people rather than, actively inviting them and sort of inviting them into situations because they truly want them there. Nosy people tend to be sort of those people who are hangers on, if that makes sense. And I don't say that to be unkind. I say that because as I've pointed out already, nosy people tend to make others uncomfortable. If not all the time, at least some of the times. And some people tend to feel uncomfortable around them. So nosy people are not always sort of your first choice when you think of who you want to be friends with or who you want to invite to a gathering. And I think nosy people tend to be surrounded by others who are either also nosy or don't mind the nosiness so much, or people who are just kind-hearted and want to include those nosy people. And it tends to be less kind of true, authentic connection going on. Again, that's just something that I've noticed. And I think this applies to both benign nosy people and malicious nosy people. I do really believe that nosy people have a great deal of difficulty relating to someone on an authentic level. If they were able to authentically connect with people, I think they would be much more able to pick up on the cues that someone is uncomfortable with their line of questioning, and they'd be able to back off, because true authentic connection is about being sensitive to the cues of the other person. And I've noticed nosy people are either oblivious to the cues that you're putting out, that you're uncomfortable with what they're asking you, or they don't care. So we've spoken a little bit about nosy people. I think it's also important to mention that in my experience, and this might not apply across the board, but in my experience, nosy people, as I've already mentioned, tend to kind of operate on a belief system that's based on stereotypes or kind of widely held tropes about people. They need to kind of categorize people into certain archetypes or certain stereotypes or caricatures, because that's how they kind of deal with the world. That's how they put other people into boxes, is using kind of old, tired stereotypes and caricatures. So nosy people will often be the sorts of people making the sexist or maybe racist comments or jokes, or kind of making assumptions about people based on just a few characteristics about them. And it's just because they really lack that deeper awareness of, who an authentic person is, and getting to know someone on an authentic level. It's much easier for them to liken you to maybe a character that they've seen in a movie or a TV show, or someone that they already have a predisposed opinion about, or preconceived notion about, I should say. So I'm interested to know if you've also noticed that about nosy people. I certainly have. And those people who kind of tend to have a problem seeing someone as a real person, but instead see them as sort of a stereotype or a caricature, are people you might just want to be a bit careful of, because they're going to have a great deal of difficulty getting to know you as an individual. They're going to be kind of way too tempted at every turn to try and make you fit into a mold or a box that they have created. So just yet another reason to sort of distance yourself from nosy people. Let's go on to how nosy people tend to make you feel. I'm just going to take a sip of my cream soda first. So if you are anything like me, And by that, I mean someone who's pretty introverted, pretty sensitive, pretty private. Nosy people probably make you intensely uncomfortable. Now, I will just say, first of all, there are people who are not really all that bothered by nosy people. A lot of people don't mind them. And this video is probably not really geared towards those people, but I certainly am aware of the fact that some people just are not overly bothered by nosy people. They either don't notice the nosiness, or they don't mind answering the questions. They don't really have a huge need for privacy. Or they're nosy themselves, and so they understand the nosy behavior, or else they're just thick-skinned and it just doesn't tend to bother them or hurt them in any way. And that's fine, that's valid. Although I will just say I've made videos previously talking about why I think it is worth reconsidering how much you share with other people, especially when you think about the type of relationship you have with them. It's worth really examining whether you want to share too much. I don't believe in oversharing. I don't think there's really any advantage to it. And I think it can blow up in your face more often than not. I really think that there is a great deal of benefit and merit to the idea of keeping private things private, or keeping, your personal business between you and only those people who actually need to know about it, and not broadcasting it out to everybody. It's one thing to go to a trusted friend or confidant or close family member, someone you trust, and ask for advice and help, or just to chat to them, knowing that what you share will not be broadcast to everybody. And it's another thing to just share indiscriminately with anyone who asks you. I don't think that's wise at all. And as I say, I've made videos about this previously. But there are people who are not bothered by nosy people, and that's okay. This video is probably not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. Or maybe it will. Maybe it'll get you to rethink the situation or think about it differently. Either way, this video is probably more geared towards those who are really bothered by nosy people, which is probably why you clicked on the video to begin with. But I'm one of those people who is intensely bothered by nosy people. It makes me extremely uncomfortable when someone I don't know very well, or someone I'm not very close to, or someone I haven't chosen to share certain details with, comes right up to me and in a rather invasive way starts asking me personal questions, sometimes deeply personal questions. I've had people who hardly know me ask me deeply personal questions, and I'm sure many of you have had the exact same experience. Questions like, how old are you? When are you getting married? Are you planning on having any children? If not, why not? Personal questions about your family, personal questions about your health, personal questions about your pets, personal questions about your education, personal questions about your looks. All these sorts of questions I've had from people who don't know me very well, or people I've never kind of shared those topics with. And so they would have no reason to think that I was actually comfortable sharing those topics. And yet they very kind of unashamedly will ask those questions. And then it's kind of up to you to be the one to put in the boundaries. You're kind of put on the back foot. You're the one feeling uncomfortable and kind of scrambling for a way to handle this conversation. And I just think it's an incredibly unfair position to put someone in. So I'm not a fan of nosy people. That's not to say that I dislike them you know, as a person. I'm not making any kind of judgments about their character or what kind of heart they might have. They might be lovely, kind people at heart, but at the very least, they're very unself-aware, or they're very unaware of how their line questioning and talking affects others. And I've noticed that nosy people often tend to go hand in hand with people who have verbal diarrhea, people who can't stop talking. Nosy people often overshare about themselves. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So you get two types of nosy people in this sense. You get those nosy people who also overshare about their own lives, even when you haven't asked and you don't want to know. They'll overshare about health issues, family issues, personal issues, all kinds of things. Or you get those nosy people who never share anything about themselves and instead just kind of collect information about others. And I tend to find that the more malicious type of nosy people tend to fall into the category of those who share very little about themselves and instead just kind of collect other people's personal information and kind of store it up in a treasure trove, just waiting to use it when the time is right. But you do just get nosy people who just have very poor boundaries and overshare about themselves, as well as ask you very intrusive and personal questions. So for me anyway, it makes me intensely uncomfortable. I tend to get this feeling like I just want to clam up. I tend to start actually physically backing away from the person, starting to think of excuses about how I can, to get me out of the situation or to try and cut the conversation short. I tend to start feeling very angry. It makes me incredibly annoyed when someone starts asking very pointed personal questions that I don't want to answer. And because of my background, because of how I was raised to be incredibly well-mannered and polite, it also tends to induce feelings of guilt and shame in me, because I start to feel like maybe I'm the one being rude, that I don't want to talk to this person. And I've had to, over the years, really have pep talks with myself where I've said, it's not you being rude that you don't want to answer these personal questions. Rather, it's the other person who's being bad-mannered. And they're the ones actually being rude because they have no right to ask these personal questions. And they're the ones being insensitive and not you. And I just want to say that to you guys as well. Those of you who might be feeling guilty or might be feeling as if you're being rude for not wanting to answer someone's nosy, intrusive questions. You are not the one being rude in that situation. They are. And you are not the one who should be feeling guilty or shameful. They are. They should be the ones sort of thinking to themselves, oh, maybe I shouldn't be asking this question. It's not really any of my business. And that's the attitude I want you to go into these sorts of situations with. That's the attitude I have started to cultivate when I come across a nosy person. Is this person, whether negligently or whether intentionally or unintentionally, they are actually being rude and bad-mannered, and they are the ones making me feel uncomfortable and not the other way around. And so if you need to push back, which I strongly recommend that you do, and that makes them uncomfortable, just know they're the ones who have created the situation and not you. The uncomfortable situation, that is. So nosy people can leave us feeling uncomfortable for many reasons. If you are anything like me, you might prefer just to keep private details and situations in your life to yourself until you're ready to share. And that is very healthy and very valid. And when someone comes along and kind of pressures you to talk about something you're not ready to talk about, it can leave you feeling very vulnerable. And that's because it does make you vulnerable to share about something that you are not ready to share about or that you don't want to share about. It can have the effect of bringing up feelings that you are not really wanting to deal with in that moment. It can open up old wounds, and very often nosy people have a habit of putting you in that situation when you are in an environment that is not really safe for you to deal with all those feelings that they might be bringing up. If someone comes along and asks you, oh, so how, say you're at work and you're busy with a kind of a work-related task, and someone comes up to you and says, oh, how are you feeling about your friend's death? Didn't they die 3 months ago? Are you coping okay? It must have been so traumatic for you. They are putting you in a situation to have to deal with feelings that are very difficult and painful and make you feel very vulnerable, whilst you are in an environment where it's not really conducive to dealing with those feelings. You're busy with a work-related task, which needs you to be in a sort of professional mindset. You can't really afford to fall apart emotionally at work. And so what they're doing really is rather inconsiderate and unkind. And I would say even selfish, because they're putting their own need for information and, gossip or whatever their motive might be for wanting to ask you that information. But they're putting their own need for that information above your need to focus on what you're doing in a safe and healthy way. And so that brings me to another opinion, which might be a little bit controversial. But I think nosy people are selfish, and maybe not selfish in a malicious way, but selfish at least in the sense that they don't give a lot of thought to other people's comfort level. They're selfish in a kind of garden variety, unintentional way, which many people are selfish. People who really are kind of quite self-absorbed and don't spend much of their day thinking about other people's feelings, or don't really put themselves in other people's shoes all that often. They just tend to go about their day thinking mostly of what makes them happy. And you get lots of people like that. And I would say nosy people definitely fall into that category of just kind of garden variety selfishness. It might not be malicious selfishness, but it is selfishness that prioritizes their own comfort and happiness over yours. So with that in mind, I really do hope that you can dispel any sort of sense of guilt or shame that you might feel for pushing back against a nosy person. And, many of the things that they might ask you about just might be things that you wouldn't necessarily want to tell anyone. And they will often make you feel as if they're owed that information. Nosy people are quite entitled as well. This is the other thing. They, on some level, believe that they're entitled to ask you the questions that they're asking you. And I think this is often why nosy people, not always, but often nosy people tend to be of an older generation, and often the person that they're being nosy towards is someone younger, because there is this kind of power disparity between an older person and a younger person, where an older nosy person kind of doesn't respect the rights of a younger person, and so feels as if they are just entitled to know whatever information they might want to ask of that younger person. This is something I've noticed. There's often this kind of age disparity between the nosy person and the person that's being targeted by the nosy person. And so just be conscious of that, nosy people on some level feel as if they have a right to that information. And to be honest, that belief alone kind of makes me quite angry and annoyed, because no one has a right to the information, the personal information or the personal business of another person. So yeah, you might have your nosy aunt or your nosy grandmother or your nosy cousin, or a nosy co-worker, as I say, and on some level they believe that you will actually answer their nosy, intrusive personal questions. And just remember that the things that they're asking you are that's your property. Your information, your personal information belongs to you, and you're under no obligation to give it away just because someone else acts as if they're entitled to it. On that note, I've noticed that nosy people will often be the same people who tend to intrude on your personal space. They'll be the kinds of people who will often, insist on hugging and kissing children, even when the children don't want it and don't like it. The kids are kind of trying to get away, but the people who are nosy often just don't care about the personal space of others. They'll be the sorts of people who will corner you at the photocopier, or corner you in the filing room and just start, firing away with their nosy questions. They'll be the sort of people who will come like maybe right up to you at your desk and put their hand on your shoulder, even whilst you're in the middle of doing something else, or they'll sort of make very direct eye contact and be too much inside your personal space. Let me know if you've noticed that, but I certainly have. And so that can be another layer to the discomfort that we can feel around nosy people. And it can be another reason why it's really important to get them to back off. So let's move on to part 3, which is how to handle nosy people. And these situations can be really stressful, so it's very important to handle them in such a way that you restore your own sense of peace and well-being, that you restore your own sense of privacy and autonomy, and that you can actually feel comfortable and okay in situations where nosy people are present. And this is obviously all the more important if the nosy person is someone you have to see on a regular basis, like a co-worker, like perhaps a close family member, even a close friend, maybe someone that you're not willing to sever your friendship with, but they just have this quality about them that they're very nosy. It's really important to get this aspect of the dynamic under control. I would just encourage you to, if this person is someone that you are in some sort of close relationship with, whether it's a family member or a friend, I would just encourage you to maybe rethink that relationship a little bit. If they are making you feel uncomfortable on a regular basis, is this really someone that you want to be close to? If they are someone who has a habit or a tendency to ignore your boundaries, and aren't sensitive to your cues, that you don't appreciate the nosiness, is this someone that you really want to gift your closeness to? Because someone being close to us is a privilege, it's an honor, and I personally am of the belief that is something that needs to be earned through consistent kindness and respect and trustworthiness. And nosy people aren't necessarily the most respectful or trustworthy. They tend to be gossipy as well. You have to really ask yourself if this person is nosy, and if they manage to extract information out of you, can you be sure that they are not sharing it with, all and sundry? So I would just encourage you to rethink that relationship possibly. How close do you really want to be to someone who doesn't have a great deal of respect for your boundaries? I personally, and again, this is just me personally, I personally can't have any kind of close relationship with a nosy person. The people that I have within my inner circle are people who respect my need to only share what I'm comfortable sharing, and they wait for me to confide in them rather than trying to extract information from me. For me, it's a non-negotiable. It's a deal breaker. If someone is overly intrusive or nosy, it's something I personally can't handle whatsoever. You might feel differently, and I just encourage you to find, your comfort level around that. But let's say that this is someone that you have to see on a regular basis. If it's a stranger, let's look at strangers first. So a stranger who you maybe meet for the first time and they are overly intrusive or nosy, I would say you just want to get away from that situation as quickly as possible. Whether or not you choose to share anything with them, someone who is nosy right off the bat is probably someone who doesn't have a great deal of respect for you. And so I would not really necessarily encourage you to pursue any sort of relationship with that person. You might just want to back away and get away from that situation as soon as possible. But if this is someone you need to see on a regular basis, I would encourage you to do a few things. Firstly, as I said, nosy people tend to be talkative. So if you don't want to share, just start disciplining yourself to speak less in those conversations. This might seem kind of really obvious, but if you are a chatty person, or if you're a person who enjoys talking to others, you might find yourself sharing before you've even noticed, before you've even realized what you're doing. And then you think back later and you're like, oh, why did I tell that person that information? But I would start with just speaking less in conversations with nosy people. Just discipline yourself to keep quiet. Let them do the talking. Even if they ask a question, just discipline yourself to not answer it. Sometimes they'll ask it again. And that's when I encourage you to speak really slowly. That's a strategy I find works really well. And often they run out of patience before they've actually got the information from you that they were looking for. So don't talk. And then if you do talk, speak really slowly, both to kind of put them off the scent and hope that they kind of get bored before they get the information out of you that they want, but also it gives you a chance to think about what you actually want to share. So get used to slowing down the tempo of the way that you talk and using lots of ums and gosh, I'm not sure. Let me think. Expressions like that help to buy you time without, letting you share any information. And then you can actually think about what you want to say. Whilst you're taking your time, you can think about what you want to say and how you want to say it. The next thing I would encourage you to do is be really vague. If you feel really put on the spot, like you've been cornered and you feel as if you have to give some kind of answer, and I understand there might be situations that arise like that where you feel like you have to say something, master the art of being very vague. There is a technique that therapists use called gray rock, and that is brilliant in situations like this. Grey rock basically means that you just become like very uninteresting and very kind of nondescript, and there's nothing about you that piques the interest of the person that you're talking to. So you become really vague, really kind of shallow, superficial, just only give very superficial, vague details. So if I were to give an example, let's say someone asks me when I'm going to get married, which did happen to me the other day. And let's say I feel as if I have to respond because they've cornered me and I'm in a very awkward situation. I would say something like, that's a very interesting question. Gosh, I've given it some thought. Gosh, I'm not actually in any hurry, but I'm not sure. Getting married is really expensive. And I find that sort of answer works really well with a nosy person because you haven't given anything away, nothing. You've said it's an interesting question, that you've given it a lot of thought, but you haven't told them why it's an interesting question or what you've been thinking about it. And you've also said getting married is expensive, which is objectively true. But you haven't said that that's the reason why you haven't set a date for getting married, or like if it was me. I've just simply kind of thrown out some generalities and vague answers that have nothing to do with my own personal situation. But it gives them something, and then they're on the back foot, and the onus is on them to kind of, if they are determined to get something out of you, to keep digging. But it makes them more uncomfortable because a lot of nosy people, once you've given a vague answer, don't really have the audacity to keep digging. They'll often just kind of slink away and not bother you anymore. And I would encourage you to just keep doing that. Just keep coming up with really vague, brief answers that don't actually say anything at all. Speak really slowly, take your time, use a lot of ums and goodness, wow, let me think about that. And just, maybe build up a repertoire of little sayings that you can use that are really vague and that don't actually give anything away. And so that's the one strategy that I find is incredibly, incredibly effective. Because if over time they find they're not actually getting information out of you, they will just get kind of frustrated or tired of asking you questions because you're not really giving them anything. So they tend to just move on to the next target after a while. And so that's the one strategy that I strongly recommend that you use. Another related strategy that I recommend that you use is just avoidance. Avoid being cornered by nosy people as much as possible. If you see them coming and you know that you're in an environment where it's possible for them to corner you, just leave before they, before they're able to corner you. This is something that I've actually started doing a lot. You just suddenly have something else important that you need to be doing that's in a different room, or suddenly need to go to the bathroom or to the kitchen or to go and get a drink of water, or if it's at work, maybe you suddenly have an important work-related task that you need to do. And nosy people tend not to be very kind of they tend not to look into things like that too deeply. And so they'll eventually just see you as someone who is a very busy person and maybe just someone who doesn't like to talk too much. And that will over time get them to leave you alone more and more because you're not satisfying their need for gossip and for whatever information they want from you. So just avoid them as much as possible. The third strategy that I want to talk about that I think is incredibly effective, and I haven't really heard too many people suggesting it, or I haven't heard anyone suggesting it, but it works very well for me, is just cultivate a reputation for yourself, around the nosy person as someone who doesn't share too much about your personal life. This involves a certain amount of discipline, self-discipline on your part. You have to discipline yourself not to share about your personal life when that nosy person is around. I'm not saying that you can't share personal information with anyone, but if the person you are sharing with is in the same, if the nosy person is in the same room as the person you want to share with, you might need to just discipline yourself and not share until they've left the room. So basically, you just want to cultivate an image in the nosy person's mind that you are someone who doesn't share about your personal life, because that will make it all the more uncomfortable for them to ask you personal questions. If you are someone who's very open about sharing things in your personal life, even if you think they're very benign things like what you had for dinner the night before or what you're doing on the weekend, you might think those are very benign personal details that you don't mind sharing. But in the nosy person's mind, it gives them permission to think that they can ask you even more intrusive and nosy personal questions, because they will get the sense that you don't mind talking about your personal life. And so you want to just walk that back to the point that you're really not sharing about yourself. You just have to discipline yourself not to share around that nosy person. Be selective about who you talk to and make sure that the people that you talk to are trustworthy people who are not going to just go and blab about what you've said. And when you're around that nosy person, just keep the conversation really superficial, really vague. If it's at work, just keep it about work-related matters. If they ask you questions like, what are you doing on the weekend? You can give very vague answers like, oh, I don't have too much planned, or, oh, I'm just going to chill, something like that. If it's family, again, same sort of story. Get into the habit of not sharing personal details when the nosy person is around. Because, as I said, that does two things. First, as I mentioned, it lets the person know that you are not someone who really likes sharing about your personal life. And secondly, it doesn't give them ammunition to have, it gives them less to ask you about. If they just don't know anything about you, they don't have a springboard to ask you more questions. It's kind of just about guarding your own personal information, kind of like Fort Knox, when that nosy person is around, so that they just don't have access to anything. They don't have any ammunition. They don't have any conversation fodder to use in order to ask you nosy personal questions. So you might find your interactions with this nosy person become extremely limited. For me, that's exactly what I would want. You kind of get to a point where your relationship with them is incredibly surface level and limited, and you're not discussing personal topics at all. Just remember that whilst this nosy person might be very intrusive and rude, they do require your participation in order to perpetuate their nosiness. So if you are just not giving them anything, then they really can't continue. And this is something that it can feel weird at first to do this, to not share anything about yourself around this nosy person. But it gets easier with time, and you'll find yourself just feeling much more peaceful and comfortable and less stressed around that nosy person, because they will get to a point eventually where they know they're not going to get anything out of you, so they will stop prying, because it's just a kind of a waste of their time and energy. And I think the best thing about these strategies that I've shared is that they involve almost no conflict between you and the nosy person. I watched a video the other day where a woman was talking about an interaction that she had with a particularly nosy neighbor, where she got so angry that she just started tearing strips off him and becoming incredibly aggressive towards this neighbor who was being nosy. And although I can understand that, I can understand why a nosy person would just make you feel absolute fury and rage and just this intense irritation because they're prying into things that have nothing to do with them. I can understand why that would make you angry, but it can sometimes cause more of a mess for you to clean up, and it doesn't necessarily make you feel so good afterwards to have blown up at somebody. And so having a very low conflict ways of dealing with nosy people, I think is preferable, because it keeps everyone's feelings intact. It makes you feel as if you've kind of maintained your dignity and your grace and your manners, and as if you've actually been respectful, not only of them, but also of yourself. And it just allows everyone to continue fairly peacefully without drama or conflict. You know, drama and conflict are problems in and of themselves, and they don't always just kind of dissipate and go away. So I personally try to avoid any kind of drama or conflict as much as possible. Having said that, there are times when, you know, a more assertive approach is necessary. If someone is malicious and nosy, then you might need to take a more assertive approach with them, because that person might also be a bit of a bully, and bullies respond to strength. So, yeah, I'm not saying that the no conflict, peaceful way of dealing with a nosy person is right in 100% of situations, but I am saying I think it's preferable. Start with no conflict strategies for dealing with nosy people. And if the person escalates and you can see they're really kind of almost malicious with their nosiness, or they're someone who's causing you harm or just not backing off, then a more assertive approach might be necessary. You might need to get someone else involved who can deal with them, or you might need to have a more kind of assertive conversation with that person, where you specifically tell them that you don't appreciate them prying into aspects of your personal life, and you won't be answering those sorts of questions, and you hope that they will respect that and back off of it, and that might work. I think another great strategy that I heard the other day that I really liked is that if someone is trying to extract gossip out of you, if they're trying to get you to give an opinion on a situation where you don't want to share or you don't want to get involved, you can say, I have no opinion on that. Or you can say, I'm not available to talk about that. Or you can say, just the classic, I'm not comfortable sharing about that. I don't feel comfortable talking about that. I'm sorry. This conversation makes me a bit uncomfortable. And as long as you do it in a very calm and self-controlled way, most people will respond well to that. They might not necessarily like it, but the majority of people will respect that. If you just give a very kind of clear, gentle but firm statement that lets them know your position, that you don't want to get involved in talking about a particular topic. That can be a great way to deal with that. Personally, that would be sort of a last resort for me. I would much rather send an unspoken message to someone that I'm not available for gossip or talking about overly personal topics, by just slowly disengaging more and more and more until that person just stops asking me. And I've noticed that that is actually incredibly effective. I've noticed I've employed that sort of approach with many people in my life, and it does work. Because ultimately, people are not going to keep going to a dry well to try and get water. They'd rather, just divert their attention elsewhere, somewhere else where they're going to have more success. And if they're just not getting personal information out of you, they will just eventually stop trying. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed this video. I hope it's been helpful. I hope that if there is a nosy person in your life who is making you stressed and uncomfortable, you are able to meet that situation with confidence and strength. Maybe use some of the strategies I've suggested in this video. If you have any others that I haven't mentioned, any other techniques or thoughts or opinions about this topic, I'd love to hear them. I welcome all viewpoints here on my channel. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.